During the toast, I caught my husband's hand on my daughter-in-law's back. My niece just looked at me and said, "Now you know." The weight of those 3 words crushed 42 years of marriage in an instant. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I remember the exact moment my world shattered. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in September, right here in our cramped Queens apartment. The autumn light filtered through our old lace curtains, casting dancing shadows across the hardwood floor I'd polished that morning. I was wearing my best navy dress, the one with tiny pearl buttons that my mother-in-law had complimented once, years ago. My hands were shaking as I arranged the good china on our dining table. Not from excitement, though I'd told myself it was. Looking back now, I think my body knew what my mind refused to accept. We were celebrating my son Michael's promotion at the investment firm on Wall Street. After months of unemployment, he'd finally landed a position managing cryptocurrency portfolios. The relief should have been overwhelming. Instead, I felt this strange hollowness in my chest, like something vital had been scooped out of me. The smell of my famous Sunday pot roast filled the apartment, mixing with the faint aroma of my lavender perfume and the distant sounds of 39th Avenue below. Queens had been our home for 27 years. I knew every crack in these walls, every creak of the floorboards. This place held our entire married life, Michael's childhood, holiday gatherings, and quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper together. Or at least, that's what I thought it held. My daughter-in-law Sarah arrived first, her designer heels clicking against our worn linoleum. She was beautiful in that effortless way young women possess, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite the humidity. She kissed my cheek with lips that felt cold as winter morning. "Eleanor, you look lovely," she said, but her eyes were already scanning the room, looking for him. My husband Frank emerged from our bedroom, adjusting his tie. At 71, he still carried himself like the successful accountant he'd been before retirement. Salt and pepper hair perfectly combed, his best button-down shirt pressed and tucked. He smiled at Sarah first. Not me. Her. And something in that smile made my stomach twist. Michael bounded through the door moments later, his energy infectious. "Mom, this smells incredible," he said, wrapping me in a bear hug that reminded me of the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. At 38, he still had that boyish charm, though stress lines had begun to etch themselves around his green eyes, the same shade as mine. Then came my niece Emily, my sister's daughter, 28 years old, with fiery red hair and freckles scattered across her nose like constellation. Emily had always been the truth-teller in our family, the one who asked uncomfortable questions at Christmas dinner and pointed out when the emperor had no clothes. She hugged me tight, whispering, "You okay, Aunt Ellie?" Something in her voice suggested she already knew I wasn't. We gathered around the table, Frank at the head, Sarah beside him, too close beside him. Michael sat across from his wife, beaming with pride as he told us about his new responsibilities, managing investment portfolios worth millions of dollars. "The Bitcoin market alone is worth more than most small countries' GDP, he said, his eyes lighting up. "And I'll be helping clients diversify their assets across traditional stocks and cryptocurrency." Frank raised his glass of champagne, the crystal catching the afternoon light. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice carrying that authoritative tone I'd once found attractive. Now it just sounded hollow. That's when it happened. As Frank spoke, his free hand moved to Sarah's back. Not accidentally, not briefly. His palm pressed against the fabric of her silk blouse, his fingers spreading wide, intimate and possessive. I watched as if in slow motion, the way you watch a car accident unfolding. Sarah didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, a soft smile playing at her lips. The champagne glass slipped from my fingers. Crystal shattered against the hardwood, golden liquid spreading like tears across the floor I'd mopped just hours before. The sound was sharp, final. Everyone froze. That's when Emily leaned close to my ear, her voice barely a whisper but clear as a bell. "Now you know!" The room erupted in concern. Michael jumped up to clean the broken glass. Sarah reached for paper towels. Frank asked if I was hurt, but all I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears, the thunderous beating of my heart, and Emily's words echoing like a death knell. Now, you know. Know what, exactly? How long had this been happening? How blind had I been? How many signs had I missed while I was busy being the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the family caretaker who held everyone together? I excused myself to the kitchen, my legs unsteady beneath me. Emily followed, closing the door behind us. "How long have you known?" I whispered, gripping the counter to keep from falling. "Months," she said softly. "I've seen them together when you're working late at the diner, at her apartment, at that little cafe on Roosevelt Avenue." Each word was a knife between my ribs. "I kept hoping you'd notice. I couldn't be the one to tell you, but I couldn't watch you keep living a lie either." The kitchen walls seemed to close in around me. 42 years of marriage. 42 years of believing in us, in him, in the life we'd built together. I thought of all the times he'd come home late, claiming overtime at the tax office. All the weekends he'd spent helping Sarah with her business paperwork, while I worked double shifts to help Michael with his rent. Sarah had started her own consulting business 6 months ago, something about helping small companies invest their profits wisely. Frank had been so eager to help her set up her financial systems, to share his expertise. I'd been proud of him for being such a supportive father-in-law. How pathetic was that? I splashed cold water on my face, staring at myself in the small mirror above our kitchen sink. When had these lines around my eyes become so deep? When had my brown hair become more gray than brown? When had I started looking so tired all the time? "Aunt Ellie," Emily said gently, "what are you going to do?" I didn't know. For the first time in my life, I had no idea what came next. We returned to the dining room where the celebration continued without missing a beat. Frank was telling a story about his early days in accounting, back when computers were the size of refrigerators. Michael was laughing, hanging on every word. Sarah was smiling that perfect smile, her hand resting casually near Frank's on the table. I sat down and watched my family like I was seeing them for the first time. Really seeing them. Michael, so focused on his father's approval that he never noticed his wife's wandering affections. Frank, animated and charming in a way he hadn't been with me in years. Sarah, beautiful and cunning and playing a game I'd never realized was happening. And me, 68 years old, sitting at my own table, in my own home, feeling like a stranger. The conversation turned to Michael's new job, to the fortune that could be made in smart investments. "The key is diversification," Frank was saying, his hand now openly resting on Sarah's shoulder. "Stocks, bonds, real estate, even some cryptocurrency. Bitcoin alone has created more millionaires in the last decade than any other investment vehicle. That's what Sarah's been helping me understand," Michael said, smiling at his wife with such love and trust it broke my heart. "She has a real gift for this stuff. Dad's been teaching her everything he knows about financial planning." "I'll bet he has," I thought bitterly. The afternoon dragged on like a slow torture. Every casual touch between Frank and Sarah felt like another betrayal. Every time Michael praised their professional collaboration, I wanted to scream. Emily caught my eye periodically, offering silent support, but mostly I felt utterly alone in a room full of my own family. When the party finally ended, I hugged Michael goodbye with desperate intensity. "I love you," I whispered into his ear, memorizing the feel of his arms around me. "Love you too, Mom," he said, pulling back to study my face. "You seem different today. Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Just tired, sweetheart." Sarah kissed my cheek again. That same cold peck. "Thank you for dinner, Eleanor. It was perfect as always." Her eyes met mine for just a moment, and I saw something there. Not guilt. Not shame. Something like pity mixed with triumph. Frank walked them to the door, his hand on Sarah's lower back. "See you Tuesday," he called after her as they waited for the elevator. Tuesday. What was Tuesday? He returned to the living room where I was stacking plates, moving like my bones were made of glass. "Great party, Ellie," he said, loosening his tie. "Sarah really appreciated all the effort you put in." "I'm sure she did," I managed to say. That night, I lay in bed listening to Frank's steady breathing and staring at the ceiling. Our bedroom felt different somehow, contaminated by knowledge I couldn't unknow. The The streetlights outside cast familiar patterns on our walls, the same patterns I'd watched for nearly 3 decades. But nothing would ever be the same. I thought about Tuesday. What happened on Tuesdays? I worked the morning shift at Mickey's Diner, usually got home around 3. Frank typically spent Tuesday afternoons at the senior center playing chess with his old accounting buddies. At least, that's what he told me. The weight of realization settled on my chest like a stone. How many lies had I believed? How many times had I made excuses for his absences, his distraction, his growing emotional distance? When had I become so invisible in my own life? Sleep didn't come until nearly dawn, and when it did, it brought dreams of shattered champagne glasses and whispered secrets. I've always been the kind of person who gives until it hurts, then gives some more. My mother raised me to believe that a woman's worth was measured by her capacity for sacrifice, for putting everyone else's needs before her own. A good wife makes her husband's life easier, she used to say. A good mother puts her children first, always. For 42 years, I lived by those rules. When Frank was studying for his CPA license, I worked 2 jobs to support us. When Michael was born, I quit my bookkeeping position to stay home with him. When Frank's mother developed dementia, I cared for her in our home for 6 years until she passed. When Michael struggled in college, I took night shifts at the diner to help with tuition. I kept detailed records of every sacrifice in a mental ledger, not out of resentment, but out of love. Each late night, each missed vacation, each time I said, "We can't afford it," to something I wanted, was an investment in our family's future happiness. I believed in delayed gratification, in the idea that selflessness would eventually be rewarded with the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. When Michael graduated from Columbia with his finance degree, Frank and I wept with pride. When he got his first job at a small investment firm in Midtown, we celebrated like he'd won the lottery. When he married Sarah 3 years ago in a beautiful ceremony in Central Park, I thought our family was complete. Sarah came from money. Her father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across Long Island. Her mother was on the board of some prestigious charity. They lived in a sprawling house in Garden City with marble countertops and a 3-car garage. I'll never forget the first time I met them at an engagement dinner at some fancy restaurant in Manhattan. They looked at Frank and me like we were quaint relics from a simpler time. "Eleanor works at a diner," Sarah's mother had said, her voice carrying just the faintest note of condescension. How charming. But Sarah seemed different then. Sweet, maybe a little naive. She told me she admired my work ethic, my dedication to family. She said she hoped to be half the mother I'd been when she and Michael had children. I was so touched I nearly cried right there over my overpriced salmon. After they married, Sarah struggled to find her footing professionally. She'd studied business at NYU but seemed overwhelmed by the idea of actually building a career. Michael was working 12-hour days, trying to establish himself in the cutthroat world of Manhattan finance. They were drowning in student loan debt and credit card bills. That's when Frank stepped in to help. "Sarah's got a good head for numbers," he told me one evening as we watched television. "She just needs someone to teach her the ropes, help her understand how wealth is really built." I offered to mentor her. It seemed natural. Frank had spent 40 years helping people manage their money, plan for retirement, make smart investments. His client list had included everyone from auto mechanics to small business owners to tech entrepreneurs who'd made fortunes in the early days of the internet. He understood stocks, bonds, real estate, and had even dabbled in cryptocurrency investing as Bitcoin and other digital currencies exploded in value. "That's wonderful," I'd said, squeezing his hand. "She's lucky to have your expertise." Soon, Frank was spending 2 afternoons a week at Sarah and Michael's apartment, helping her set up her consulting business. He taught her about portfolio management, risk assessment, tax optimization strategies. He helped her understand how to advise clients on diversifying their assets, how to spot promising startups, how to time cryptocurrency investments for maximum return. Meanwhile, I picked up extra shifts at the diner to help cover Michael's rent when a few of his deals fell through. I sent money for groceries when their budget got tight. I babysat their neighbors' kids to earn cash for Sarah's business registration fees. Every dollar I contributed felt like an investment in their future success. The irony wasn't lost on me now. I'd been funding my own husband's affair. Tuesday morning came with gray October sky and the familiar weight of dread in my stomach. I went through my morning routine on autopilot. Coffee with 2 sugars, toast with strawberry jam, checking the weather on my phone. Frank was already up, humming while he shaved. He seemed unusually cheerful for someone about to spend 4 hours playing chess with retired accountants. "Have a good day at work, sweetheart," he said, kissing my forehead. The casual endearment felt like sandpaper against my skin. "You too," I managed to reply. Mickey's Diner sits on the corner of 37th Avenue and 82nd Street. A narrow slice of Americana that's been serving Queens families for 38 years. The red vinyl booths are cracked and patched with duct tape. The coffee is strong enough to wake the dead, and the regular customers know everyone's name. It's not glamorous work, but I've always found comfort in the rhythm of it. Pour coffee, take orders, deliver plates of eggs and bacon, repeat. My shift supervisor, Danny, is a sweet kid about Michael's age, who calls me Mom Eleanor, and always makes sure I get the easier tables when my arthritis acts up. The other waitresses are like sisters to me. Maria, who sends half her paycheck to family in El Salvador, Dottie, who's been working here longer than anyone and knows every piece of diner gossip in Queens, and Jennifer, barely 22, working her way through community college. "You okay, honey?" Dottie asked around 10:30, refilling my coffee cup. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I wanted to tell her. Part of me was desperate to unload this crushing weight, to hear someone else tell me I wasn't crazy, that what I'd witnessed was real. But shame held my tongue. Admitting your husband is cheating with your daughter-in-law feels like admitting you're a failure as a woman, like you weren't enough to keep him, weren't smart enough to see it coming. "Just tired," I said instead. The morning dragged by like molasses. Every customer who called me sweetie or hon reminded me how invisible I'd become. Every time someone left without saying thank you, I felt it like a physical blow. I found myself studying the faces of the older women who came in alone, wondering if they'd been betrayed too, wondering if heartbreak was just another inevitable part of aging, like gray hair and creaking joints. Around 2 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Aunt Ellie, can you meet me after work? I have something to show you." My hands were shaking as I typed back. "What kind of something?" "The kind that will hurt but help. Trust me." Trust. Such a simple word for such a complicated concept. I'd trusted my husband completely for 4 decades. I'd trusted that my sacrifices mattered, that my love was valued, that my place in my own family was secure. Now trust felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. I clocked out at 3 and met Emily at a small cafe in Astoria. One of those trendy places with exposed brick walls and overpriced lattes that have been springing up all over Queens. She was already seated at a corner table, her red hair pulled back in a messy bun, her expression serious. "Show me," I said without preamble as I sat down. Emily pulled out her phone, her fingers hesitating over the screen. "Are you sure? Once you see this, there's no going back to not knowing." I thought about that moment at the toast, Frank's hand on Sarah's back, the casual intimacy of it. I thought about all the Tuesday afternoons, all the business meetings, all the times I'd felt like a stranger in my own home. "Show me," I repeated. She turned the phone toward me. It was a photo, taken from across the street through the window of what looked like a coffee shop. Frank and Sarah sat at a small table, their heads bent together over some papers. His hand covered hers on the table. She was laughing at something he'd said, her face bright with genuine joy. The way she looked at him was the way a woman looks at a man she loves. The way I used to look at him. "There are more," Emily said quietly, scrolling through her camera roll. Photo after photo. Frank and Sarah walking hand in hand down Roosevelt Avenue, sharing a piece of cake at a bakery I'd never heard of. Sarah's head on Frank's shoulder as they sat on a bench in Flushing Meadows Park. In every image, they looked like a couple, not like business partners or in-laws collaborating on a project, like lovers. The final photo was the worst. They were coming out of a small apartment building I didn't recognize, Frank's arm around Sarah's waist, both of them looking rumpled and satisfied. The timestamp showed it was from last Tuesday at 4:30 p.m., an hour after I'd gotten home from work. "Whose apartment?" I whispered. "Hers," Emily said. She rented it 3 months ago. Told Michael it was for client meetings, somewhere she could conduct business away from their home. She paused. I followed them there last week. They were inside for 2 hours. The cafe suddenly felt too hot, too crowded, too loud. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the October chill outside. How long have you been following them? Since August, Emily admitted. I was walking past that coffee shop on my lunch break and saw them through the window. At first I thought maybe I was mistaken, maybe it was innocent. But then I kept seeing them together when you were at work. And the way they looked at each other. She shook her head. I started taking pictures because I knew no one would believe me without proof. Does Michael know? God, no. He thinks Sarah is working with Frank to build her business. He brags about how well they're getting along, how grateful he is for his father's mentorship. I stared at the photos until they blurred with tears. 42 years of marriage. 28 years of being Sarah's mother-in-law. All of it reduced to secrets and lies and stolen afternoon rendezvous while I served coffee to strangers and counted tips. What am I supposed to do with this? I asked. Emily reached across the table and took my hand. That's up to you, but you deserve to know the truth. That evening, I cooked dinner like nothing had changed. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes, Frank's favorite meal. I set the table with our everyday dishes, poured him a glass of red wine, made small talk about my day at the diner. He told me about his chess games, how he'd beaten Harold Peterson 3 matches in a row. Such an easy lie. So smoothly delivered. You seem quiet tonight, he said, cutting into his meatloaf. Just thinking about things, I replied. What kind of things? I looked at him across our small dining table. This man I'd shared my entire adult life with. The father of my child. The person I'd trusted with every dream, every fear, every hope for our future. His hair was thinner now, his face more lined, but his eyes were the same deep brown I'd fallen in love with at 19. Those eyes had looked into mine while we exchanged wedding vows. Those eyes had cried with happiness when Michael was born. Those eyes had promised me forever. Now they looked at me with mild curiosity and barely concealed impatience, like I was a waitress taking too long to bring his check. Nothing important, I said. The next few weeks passed in a strange fog of hyper-awareness and numbness. Every Tuesday, I watched Frank get dressed with extra care. Every Tuesday evening, I studied his face for signs of guilt or satisfaction. He never displayed either. He was the same Frank he'd always been, distant but polite, affectionate in an automatic sort of way, present in body but absent in spirit. I found myself noticing things I'd overlooked for years. How he never really listened when I talked about my day. How he changed the subject whenever I brought up plans for our future. How he'd stopped complimenting my appearance, stopped initiating physical intimacy, stopped seeming to see me as anything more than a familiar piece of furniture. When had I become invisible to my own husband? I started paying attention to Sarah, too, analyzing her behavior during our weekly family dinners. She was always perfectly polite, always willing to help with dishes or setting the table. But there was something calculated about her kindness, like she was playing a role. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, I caught her watching me with a strange expression. Not guilt, exactly. More like she was studying an opponent, trying to predict my next move in a game I didn't know I was playing. Michael, sweet Michael, remained completely oblivious. He talked enthusiastically about Sarah's growing business, how much money she was making helping small companies optimize their investment strategies. Dad really knows his stuff, he said one Sunday over dessert. Sarah's learned so much from him. Her clients are seeing 20 to 30% returns on their portfolios, especially the ones who invested in cryptocurrency early. That's wonderful, I said, wondering how much of Sarah's success came from genuine business acumen and how much came from intimate access to Frank's 40 years of financial expertise. We're thinking about buying a house, Michael continued. Something in Garden City near Sarah's parents. Dad's been helping us understand the real estate market, what neighborhoods are good investments. Of course he had. November arrived with a cold snap that made my arthritis scream. I'd been waitressing for 6 years, ever since Frank retired, and our fixed income wasn't enough to cover the rising costs of living in Queens. My back ached constantly. My feet were a mess of bunions and calluses, and I came home exhausted every single day. But the money was necessary, especially since I'd been helping Michael and Sarah with their expenses. Or at least, I thought I'd been helping them. Now I wondered if my hard-earned tips were just freeing up more of their income for afternoons in secret apartments and romantic dinners I'd never been invited to. I started doing math in my head during slow periods at the diner. In the 6 years I'd been working, I'd probably contributed $15,000 to Michael and Sarah's household. Rent money when Michael was between jobs. Grocery money when their budget was tight. Gas money for Sarah's car. Money for Michael's professional wardrobe when he started interviewing for new positions. $15,000. Earned $25 or $30 at a time, one table at a time, one aching shift at a time. Money that could have gone toward my own retirement, my own security, my own small pleasures. Instead, I'd handed it over gladly, happily, because I believed I was investing in my family's future. The realization that I'd been funding my husband's midlife crisis felt like a physical blow. Thanksgiving was approaching, and Sarah mentioned several times that her parents had invited them to Garden City for dinner. "It's important that we spend time with both families," she said diplomatically. But I could read between the lines. The Garden City celebration would feature expensive wine and catered food, and conversation about stock portfolios and vacation homes. Our Queens apartment would offer my home-cooked turkey and discount store wine and talk about diner customers and television shows. I wasn't surprised when Michael called the Tuesday before Thanksgiving to say they wouldn't be joining us after all. "Sarah's mom is going through a hard time," he explained. "She really needs the family support right now." "Of course," I said. "Family first." The irony of those words tasted bitter in my mouth. Frank seemed relieved when I told him we'd be spending Thanksgiving alone. "Honestly, it'll be nice to have a quiet day," he said. "Just the two of us. Just the two of us." Once upon a time, that phrase would have filled me with warmth. Now it felt like a prison sentence. I spent Thanksgiving morning cooking a meal for two that could have fed 8, because cooking was the only thing that felt normal anymore. The apartment filled with the familiar smells of roasted turkey and sage stuffing, green bean casserole and cranberry sauce. I set our small table with the good china, lit candles, put on a playlist of soft jazz. Frank complimented the meal and made conversation about the football game on television. We talked about the weather, about our neighbor's noisy dog, about a funny story Dottie had told me from the diner. Surface-level pleasantries between two people who'd run out of real things to say to each other. After dinner, while Frank dozed in his recliner, I stood at our kitchen window looking down at 39th Avenue. Queens on Thanksgiving evening is a mixture of bright apartment windows and quiet streets. The sounds of other families celebrating filtering up from neighboring buildings. I thought about all the Thanksgivings we'd hosted over the years, when our apartment had been filled with Michael's friends from college, with Frank's colleagues and their wives, with extended family and neighbors and anyone who needed a place to belong. When had our home become so empty? That night, I opened my laptop and did something I'd never done before. I Googled, "Signs your spouse is cheating." The articles that appeared read like a checklist of my marriage over the past year. Increased attention to appearance, unexplained absences, sudden interest in privacy, emotional distance, sexual withdrawal, new hobbies or interests, defensiveness when questioned about activities. Check, check, check. I stayed up until 3 in the morning reading testimonies from other women who'd discovered their husbands' affairs. Their stories were all variations of the same theme: shock, denial, anger, grief, and the terrible realization that they'd been living with a stranger. Many of them talked about feeling like fools for not seeing the signs sooner. Others described the strange relief that came with finally understanding why their marriages had felt wrong for so long. One woman, writing about discovering her husband's affair after 30 years of marriage, said something that hit me like a thunderbolt. "I realized I'd been mourning the death of our relationship for years without understanding what I was grieving. That was it exactly. I'd been grieving the loss of intimacy, of partnership, of feeling truly seen and valued by my husband. I'd attributed these losses to age, to familiarity, to the natural evolution of long marriages. I'd never considered that Frank might have been giving to someone else what he'd stopped giving to me. December brought the kind of relentless gray that makes New York City feel like a black and white photograph. I found myself moving through my days like a sleepwalker, going through the motions of my life while feeling completely detached from it. Work, home, cooking, cleaning, sleeping, repeat. Frank and I existed in the same space like polite roommates, sharing meals and television shows but never really connecting. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in mid-December. I'd gotten home from work around 4, later than usual because we'd been short-staffed and I'd covered an extra table. Frank wasn't home yet, which wasn't unusual for a Tuesday. I started dinner, assuming he'd be back by 6 as always. 6 o'clock came and went. So did 7. At 8, I called his cell phone. "Hey, sweetheart," he answered, and I could hear traffic in the background. "Sorry, I'm running late. Harold wanted to grab dinner after chess practice. You go ahead and eat without me." Harold Peterson, Frank's supposed chess partner, the same Harold I'd run into at the grocery store the previous Saturday, who'd mentioned that he hadn't seen Frank at the senior center in weeks because of some scheduling conflict. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the smell of the pot roast I'd prepared for a husband who was lying to me about where he was spending his evenings. The weight of sustained deception finally broke something inside me that had been cracking for months. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of white wine we'd been saving for Christmas. I poured myself a large glass, then another, then another. By the time Frank came home at 10:30, smelling like unfamiliar perfume and offering elaborate explanations about Harold's restaurant choice and the traffic getting home, I was drunk enough to be honest. "I know," I said simply. He froze in the doorway, his keys still in his hand. "Know what?" "About the apartment. About the Tuesday afternoons. About Sarah." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Eleanor, I can explain." "Don't." The word came out sharper than I'd intended. "Don't lie to me anymore. I can't take another lie." We stared at each other across our small living room, 42 years of marriage hanging in the balance. This man who'd been my best friend, my lover, my partner in building a life. Now he looked like a stranger wearing my husband's face. "It's not what you think," he said finally. I laughed, a harsh sound that surprised us both. "It's exactly what I think. You're having an affair with our daughter-in-law. You've been having an affair with our daughter-in-law while I work extra shifts to help support her and Michael. It just happened, Ellie. We didn't plan it. We were working together so much, and she understands things about the financial world that you—" He stopped himself, but the damage was done. That I what? That I'm too stupid to understand? Too boring? Too old? That's not what I meant. "Then what did you mean, Frank? Help me understand how you justify sleeping with our son's wife." He sank into his recliner, suddenly looking every one of his 71 years. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under. Retirement isn't what I thought it would be. I feel useless, invisible. Sarah makes me feel needed again, important. The wine made me bold. So, you decided to blow up our family because you needed an ego boost? I never meant for it to go this far. It started innocently, just mentoring, just helping her understand business finances. She was so eager to learn, so appreciative of my knowledge. And she looked at me like I was still someone worth respecting. Each word was a knife between my ribs. And I don't? You look at me like I'm your roommate, Ellie. Like I'm a piece of furniture you're used to having around. When did we stop really talking? When did we stop seeing each other? The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. We had grown apart, had settled into parallel lives that intersected mainly around household logistics. But I'd attributed that to the natural rhythm of long marriages, not to a fundamental lack of love or respect. So, this is my fault? I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm saying we both let our marriage die a long time ago. Sarah just helped me remember what it felt like to be alive. I stood up too quickly, the wine and the revelation making me dizzy. Does Michael know? God, no. And he can never know. This would destroy him. So we're all supposed to just pretend? I'm supposed to keep serving you dinner and washing your clothes and making conversation while you're in love with someone else? I'm not in love with her, Frank said, but his eyes didn't meet mine when he said it. Don't lie to me anymore, I repeated. Please. I've heard enough lies. That night, I slept in Michael's old bedroom for the first time in our marriage. The twin mattress was uncomfortable. The sheets smelled like the lavender sachets I'd stored them with years ago, but it felt safer than sharing a bed with a stranger. I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what came next. Divorce at 68 felt terrifying and impossible. We'd built a life together, accumulated 42 years' worth of shared memories and assets. We owned our apartment, had retirement accounts in both our names, had established routines and relationships that were completely intertwined. More importantly, we shared a son who loved us both and would be devastated to learn the truth about his father's relationship with his wife. How could I destroy Michael's world to salvage my own dignity? But how could I continue living this lie? I must have fallen asleep sometime before dawn, because I was awakened by the smell of coffee and bacon. Frank had made breakfast, something he hadn't done in years. He appeared in the doorway of Michael's room, looking haggard and uncertain. "I made your favorite," he said quietly. "Pancakes with blueberries." I followed him to the kitchen, where he'd set the table with our good dishes and fresh orange juice. The gesture was so reminiscent of our early marriage, when small kindnesses were regular expressions of love, that it almost broke my heart all over again. "We need to talk about what happens now," I said as we sat down to eat. "I ended it," Frank said immediately. "Last night after our conversation, I called Sarah and told her it was over, that it was wrong and had to stop." "Just like that?" "Just like that." I wanted to believe him. Part of me desperately wanted to pretend the past few months had been a nightmare I could wake up from. We could go back to our previous life, to the comfortable routine of shared meals and separate interests. We could pretend nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Trust, once broken, doesn't simply repair itself because someone makes pancakes. "What about the apartment?" I asked. Frank's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "What apartment?" "Emily has photos of you two coming out of an apartment building on Tuesday afternoons. Sarah's secret office, apparently." He set down his fork and rubbed his face with both hands. "She told you about that? She's been watching you for months. She couldn't stand seeing me played for a fool. Christ, Eleanor. I never wanted you to be hurt by this. Then you shouldn't have done it." We sat in silence for a long time, the pancakes growing cold between us. Finally, Frank spoke. "The apartment was Sarah's idea. She said she needed a professional space to meet with clients, somewhere separate from her home life. She asked me to co-sign the lease because her credit isn't established enough for a Manhattan rental." Manhattan. The apartment was in Manhattan. How much? $3,000 a month. I nearly choked on my orange juice. $3,000 a month for a secret apartment? While I worked 6-day weeks at a diner in Queens, my husband was spending more on his affair than we spent on our household expenses. "Where were you getting that kind of money?" Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I've been managing some investments on the side. Cryptocurrency mostly. Bitcoin has been very good to us this year." Us. He said us like he and Sarah were a unit, like they were partners in this financial success while I was just an outside observer. "What investments?" "Nothing risky," he said quickly. "Just some Bitcoin and Ethereum purchases when the market was low. I turned a small investment into a substantial return. Sarah understands the digital currency market better than most people twice her age." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Frank had been using his expertise and connections to make money in cryptocurrency investments. Money he'd been spending on an apartment where he could conduct his affair in private. Sarah had been learning from him, gaining access to his professional knowledge while also gaining access to his body and his heart. Meanwhile, I'd been contributing my diner tips to their household expenses, unknowingly subsidizing the very relationship that was destroying my marriage. "How much money are we talking about?" Frank hesitated. "About $200,000 in profits so far." $200,000. More money than I'd earn in 5 years at the diner. More money than Frank had made in any single year during his accounting career. And I'd known nothing about it. "Where is this money?" "In Sarah's business account. She's the one who identified the opportunities, who understood the market timing. It seemed fair that the profits should go toward building her consulting firm." I stood up so abruptly that my chair fell over backward. "You gave our money to the woman you're sleeping with?" "It wasn't our money, Eleanor. It was money I earned through my own knowledge and connections. Money you earned while living in my apartment, eating food I cooked, using expertise you developed during our 42-year marriage. How is that not our money? Frank's face flushed red. Because you never showed any interest in the financial side of our life. You never wanted to understand investments or market strategies. You were content to let me handle everything while you focused on your job and your domestic responsibilities. The condescension in his voice hit me like a physical slap. So, because I trusted you to manage our finances honestly, I don't deserve to benefit from any profits? That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying, Frank? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used our marriage as a cover while you built a secret financial empire with your girlfriend. She's not my girlfriend, he said weakly. Then what is she? He couldn't answer. That afternoon, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and took the subway into Manhattan. Emily had given me the address of Sarah's secret apartment, a sleek, high-rise building in the financial district with a doorman and marble floors. I stood across the street and stared up at the windows, trying to imagine my husband and daughter-in-law inside, sharing intimacies I'd been excluded from. $200,000 in cryptocurrency profits, an apartment that cost more per month than most people in Queens earned. A business built on financial advice and market insights Frank had developed during our decades together. All of it hidden from me, shared instead with a woman young enough to be our daughter. I walked around the neighborhood for hours, past Wall Street and Stone Street, through the canyon of glass and steel where Michael worked, and where Frank had once dreamed of making his fortune. This was Sarah's world now, the world of high finance and digital currency, and making money from money. No wonder she'd grown tired of spending time in our cramped Queens apartment with its outdated appliances and worn furniture. By the time I got home, Frank was gone. A note on the kitchen counter said he was having dinner with Harold and would be back late. I wondered if Harold Peterson was a real person, or just another lie in the elaborate fiction my husband had constructed. I opened my laptop and spent the evening researching cryptocurrency investments and digital asset management. What I found was a world I barely understood, full of blockchain technology and mining algorithms and market volatility that could make or lose fortunes overnight. But I also found stories of ordinary people who'd become millionaires by investing early in Bitcoin, who'd used small amounts of capital to generate life-changing returns. Frank had always been conservative with our money, preferring steady returns from traditional investments to the uncertainty of emerging markets. The fact that he'd suddenly become interested in cryptocurrency suggested Sarah's influence, her understanding of a financial world that hadn't existed when Frank was building his career. I thought about all the times in recent months when Frank had seemed distracted during dinner, checking his phone constantly, muttering about market fluctuations and trading windows. I'd assumed he was just staying current with financial news out of professional habit. Now I realized he'd been actively managing a substantial investment portfolio I knew nothing about. The betrayal was multi-layered: emotional, physical, and financial. Frank hadn't just cheated on our marriage. He'd cheated me out of the economic security that should have been mine after decades of partnership. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Helen Martinez had been practicing family law in Queens for 25 years. And her office walls were covered with certificates and commendations that spoke to her expertise in complex divorce cases. She was about my age, with silver hair and shrewd eyes that had clearly seen every variation of marital deception. "Tell me what's happening," she said, gesturing for me to sit in the comfortable chair across from her desk. I told her everything: the affair, the secret apartment, the cryptocurrency investments, the money that had been earned during our marriage but hidden from me. She took notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and amounts, and how long Frank and Sarah had been collaborating professionally. "New York is an equitable distribution state," she explained when I finished. "That means marital assets are divided fairly, though not necessarily equally, in divorce proceedings. Any money your husband earned or invested during your marriage would typically be considered marital property, regardless of whose name the accounts are in. Even if he claims the profits came from Sarah's business acumen, if he used knowledge, connections, or capital acquired during your marriage to generate those profits, then yes. The fact that he was sleeping with his business partner complicates things, but doesn't necessarily change the legal reality." Helen explained the process of asset discovery, subpoenaing bank records and investment accounts to determine the full extent of Frank's financial activities. She talked about spousal support and the division of our apartment and retirement accounts. She made divorce sound like a complex business transaction, which I supposed it was. "What about my son?" I asked. "He doesn't know about any of this. The affair, the money, none of it." "That's not uncommon," Helen said gently. "Many people want to shield their adult children from the details of marital breakdown, but depending on how contentious this becomes, it might be difficult to keep him completely in the dark." I left her office with a stack of paperwork and a sick feeling in my stomach. Filing for divorce felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that 42 years of marriage could be reduced to legal documents and asset divisions. But staying married to Frank felt like accepting a life of pretense and humiliation. That evening, I sat at our kitchen table and tried to imagine my life as a divorced woman approaching 70. I'd never lived alone as an adult. I'd gone from my parents' house to married life with Frank, raising Michael in this same Queens apartment where we'd built all our memories. The idea of starting over felt overwhelming and terrifying, but the idea of continuing to live as Frank's roommate while he carried on with Sarah felt worse. Frank came home around 9, looking tired and guilty. He'd clearly been struggling with his own version of this crisis, trying to figure out how to manage his relationships with me, with Sarah, and with Michael. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, settling into his recliner. "About the money in Sarah's account. You're right that it's not fair. I can transfer your half to our joint savings." "My half?" 50% of the cryptocurrency profits. "It's only right." I stared at him across our living room, this man who'd shared my bed for over 4 decades, but apparently understood nothing about partnership or respect. "You think this is about money?" I asked. "Isn't it? You're upset that I made investments without telling you, that the profits went into Sarah's business account instead of our retirement fund. I understand why you'd feel left out. Frank, you're having an affair." "Had," he corrected. Past tense. "I told you, I ended it. You're having an affair with our son's wife. You've been lying to me for months. You set up a secret apartment and gave away money that should have been ours to build a life with someone else. And you think the problem is that I feel left out?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been genuine remorse. "What do you want me to do, Eleanor? I can't undo what happened. I can't take back the lying or the hurt I've caused. All I can do is try to make things right going forward." "I want you to leave," I said quietly. "Leave? I want you to pack a suitcase and stay somewhere else while I figure out what comes next. I can't think clearly with you here. I can't pretend everything is normal when it's not." Frank's face went pale. "This is my home too." "Yes, it is. And it's my home too. The home where I've been living a lie for months while you built a secret life with someone else. I need space to process this, to decide what I want to do. Where am I supposed to go?" The question hung in the air between us. We both knew the answer, though neither of us said it out loud. Sarah's apartment. The place where he'd been spending his Tuesday afternoons, where he'd been using our money to fund his midlife crisis. "You'll figure it out," I said. "You've gotten very good at figuring things out behind my back." He packed a suitcase that night while I sat in Michael's old room, listening to dresser drawers opening and closing, to the sounds of a marriage being dismantled one clothing item at a time. When he came to say goodbye, I refused to look at him. "I love you, Eleanor," he said from the doorway. "I know you don't believe that right now, but I do. I've always loved you. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this to us," I replied. After he left, I walked through our apartment touching things that had been ours and were now just mine. The coffee mug he always used in the morning, his reading chair with the permanent indentation from his body, the framed wedding photo on our dresser, 2 young people who'd promised to honor and cherish each other until death do us part. I picked up that photo and studied our faces, trying to remember what it felt like to be so certain about the future, so confident that love would be enough to weather any storm. We looked impossibly young and naive, dressed in our finest clothes and beaming with joy, surrounded by family and friends who'd believed in our happily ever after as much as we had. When had we stopped fighting for that happiness? When had we started taking each other for granted, assuming our love was sturdy enough to survive neglect and indifference? I'd been so focused on the practical aspects of marriage, earning money, maintaining our home, supporting Michael, that I'd forgotten to nurture the emotional connection that made all those sacrifices meaningful. But that didn't excuse Frank's betrayal. It didn't justify his lies or his decision to build intimacy with someone else instead of working to rebuild it with me. I put the photo face down in the drawer and went to bed in my own room for the first time in a week. The next few days passed in a strange mixture of relief and loneliness. I didn't have to pretend that everything was normal. I didn't have to make conversation over dinner with someone who'd been lying to me for months. But I also didn't have anyone to talk to, anyone to share the small moments of daily life with. I found myself cooking smaller portions, watching television shows Frank had never liked, staying up later than our usual routine allowed. The apartment felt different without his presence. Not necessarily better or worse, just different, quieter, more mine. Michael called on Thursday to check in, his voice bright with concern about his father's sudden absence. Dad said you two had a fight and he's staying with Harold for a few days. Are you okay? I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to explain that his father was having an affair with his wife, that his marriage was built on a foundation of lies, that the money funding their lifestyle came from investments Frank had made with a woman he was sleeping with. But the words stuck in my throat. We're just working through some issues, I said instead. Nothing you need to worry about. Are you sure? Because Sarah said she hasn't heard from Dad either, and she's worried about some business projects they were working on together. Of course she was worried. Her source of inside financial information had suddenly disappeared, along with her older lover who'd been funding her lifestyle. Everything will be fine, I told Michael. Your father and I just need some time to figure things out. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen wondering how long I could maintain this charade. Michael wasn't stupid. He'd eventually noticed that his parents weren't speaking, that his father had moved out, that his wife seemed unusually anxious about her business prospects. And when he started asking questions, what would I tell him? That night, Emily came over with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine. We spread the containers across my coffee table and ate straight from the cartons while she listened to me describe the past week's revelations. $200,000, she said, shaking her head. I knew he was helping her with business stuff, but I had no idea it was that extensive. Neither did I. Apparently, I was too stupid to understand the complicated world of cryptocurrency investing. Emily raised her chopsticks like a weapon. Don't you dare. This isn't about your intelligence or your interests. This is about him being a cheating, lying piece of shit who stole from his own wife to impress his girlfriend. Don't hold back. Tell me how you really feel. I'm serious, Aunt Ellie. You worked extra shifts for months to help them with expenses while he was making a fortune in Bitcoin. You sent them grocery money while he was spending $3,000 a month on a secret apartment. The audacity is breathtaking. I picked at my low man, my appetite diminished by the weight of everything I'd learned. Maybe he's right, though. Maybe I did let our marriage die. Maybe I stopped seeing him as anything more than a comfortable habit. Bullshit, Emily said firmly. Marriage is work, sure, but it's work that both people are supposed to do. You don't get to check out emotionally and then blame your spouse for not being interesting enough to keep your attention. What if I file for divorce and lose everything? What if he claims the Bitcoin money belongs to Sarah's business and I can't prove otherwise? Then you'll rebuild, Emily said simply. You're 68 years old, not dead. You've got skills and experience and more integrity in your little finger than Frank has in his whole body. You'll figure it out. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I ignored my household responsibilities and focused entirely on myself. I slept late, took long baths, read books I'd been meaning to get to for months. I walked through Astoria Park and sat by the East River, watching joggers and dog walkers and young families enjoying the December sunshine. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. On Sunday evening, Frank called to ask if he could come by to pick up more clothes. I agreed, but insisted that Emily be there when he came. I didn't trust myself to be alone with him. Didn't trust that I wouldn't fall back into old patterns of accommodation and forgiveness. He looked terrible when he arrived, like he hadn't been sleeping or eating properly. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unwashed, his face drawn with exhaustion. Part of me wanted to take care of him, to smooth his hair and make him soup and pretend we could go back to the way things were. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice tentative. "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. He packed another suitcase while Emily and I sat in the living room, making forced conversation about her job and the weather. When he was finished, he lingered in the doorway like he wanted to say something important. "Eleanor, I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I need you to know that what happened with Sarah wasn't about not loving you. It was about being scared of getting old, of becoming irrelevant. She made me feel like I still had something valuable to offer." "You did have something valuable to offer," I said quietly. "You had 42 years of marriage with someone who loved you completely. You had a son who respected you and looked up to you. You had a home and a history and a life that mattered. But apparently, that wasn't enough. It should have been enough," he admitted. "I know that now." After he left, Emily and I sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the strange sadness of watching a long relationship die in real time. "Do you think he really ended it with Sarah?" Emily asked. I'd been wondering the same thing. Frank was capable of elaborate deception, as the past few months had proven. His claim that he'd broken things off with Sarah might be just another lie designed to buy himself time to figure out how to manage this crisis. "I don't know," I said. "And honestly, I'm not sure it matters anymore. Even if he ended it, even if he never speaks to her again, I don't know how to trust him. I don't know how to look at him without seeing all the lies." Christmas was approaching, and with it the annual stress of family gatherings and gift exchanges and pretending everything was normal. Michael had invited Frank and me to his and Sarah's apartment for Christmas Eve dinner, unaware that his parents were separated and his wife had been sleeping with his father. I couldn't imagine sitting around their table, making small talk while Sarah and Frank avoided eye contact and I pretended not to know about their affair. But I also couldn't imagine disappointing Michael, who was already worried about the tension between his parents. 2 days before Christmas, Sarah called me directly for the first time in months. "Eleanor, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "Michael mentioned that you and Frank are going through a difficult time, and I wanted you to know that if there's anything I can do to help." The audacity was staggering. The woman who'd been sleeping with my husband was offering to mediate our marital problems. "That's very thoughtful of you," I managed to say. "I know how much your marriage means to Michael. He looks up to you and Frank so much as relationship role models. It would break his heart if anything happened to tear your family apart." She was good, I had to give her that, framing her concern in terms of Michael's emotional well-being, positioning herself as someone who cared about family harmony rather than someone who'd spent months systematically destroying it. "Family is important," I agreed. "It really is. Which is why I think it's so important for all of us to put aside any differences or misunderstandings and focus on what matters most. The people we love. Misunderstandings." She was calling her affair with my husband a misunderstanding. "Sarah," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, "I think we should probably cancel Christmas Eve dinner this year. Frank and I need some time to work through our issues without involving Michael unnecessarily." "Oh, but Eleanor, that would be such a shame. Michael is so looking forward to having everyone together. And I've already prepared so much of the meal. Maybe we could all just focus on celebrating the holiday and put other concerns aside for one night?" She wanted to host Christmas Eve with her lover's wife in attendance, playing happy family while her husband remained oblivious to the truth. The sheer balls of it left me speechless for a moment. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said finally. "Well, if you change your mind, you know you're always welcome. Both of you." After I hung up, I called Michael to explain that Frank and I wouldn't be joining them for Christmas Eve dinner. "Mom, what is going on?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. "Dad won't talk about it. You won't talk about it. But clearly something major has happened. Are you getting divorced?" The direct question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on protecting Michael from the ugly details that I hadn't prepared for him to simply ask the hard question outright. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "We're trying to figure things out. Is it about money? Because if you're worried about the help you've been giving us, Sarah's business is doing really well now. We don't need financial support anymore. Sarah's business, built on Frank's expertise and connections, funded with money that should have been mine, and probably managed from the secret apartment I'd been unknowingly helping to pay for. It's not about money, sweetheart. Then what? You and Dad have been together my entire life. What could possibly be so bad that you can't work through it? I closed my eyes and tried to find words that would be honest without being devastating. Sometimes people grow apart, Michael. Sometimes the life you've built together stops making sense for one or both people in the marriage. But you can't just give up. You're Eleanor and Frank. You're solid. You're the couple everyone else looks up to. The irony of that statement was almost funny. We'd been so good at maintaining appearances that even our own son had believed in the fiction of our perfect marriage right up until the moment it imploded. I love your father, I said. I've loved him for 42 years. But love isn't always enough to make a marriage work. That Christmas Eve, I stayed home alone for the first time in decades. I made myself a simple dinner, poured a glass of wine, and watched old movies on television. It should have been depressing, but instead, it felt peaceful. No need to make conversation. No need to manage other people's expectations or emotions. Just me, in my own space, choosing how to spend my time. Around 10 o'clock, Emily stopped by with leftover cookies from her family's celebration. How was dinner with the in-laws? I asked. Awkward as hell, she said, settling onto my couch. Everyone kept asking where you and Uncle Frank were. My mom made up some story about you having the flu, but I could tell people weren't buying it. Did you see Sarah? Oh yeah. She looked fantastic. New dress, new jewelry, very cheerful. Either she's completely heartless or she's an amazing actress. Maybe both. We spent the evening talking about everything except my marriage. Emily told me about her job at the arts nonprofit, about the guy she'd been dating, about her plans to take a pottery class in the new year. Normal conversation about normal life. The kind of easy interaction I'd missed during all those tense dinners with Frank and Sarah. What are you going to do? Emily asked as she was getting ready to leave. File for divorce, I said, the words coming out before I'd consciously made the decision. I can't live in limbo forever. Either we're married or we're not. And right now, we're definitely not. Good, she said firmly. You deserve better than this bullshit. After she left, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about what divorce would actually mean. Splitting our assets, finding a new place to live, explaining to friends and extended family why a marriage everyone thought was solid had suddenly ended. Learning to be single again at an age when most women were planning retirement activities with their longtime partners. It was scary as hell, but it was also, for the first time in months, honest. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of lawyer consultations and financial paperwork. Helen Martinez had begun the process of discovering Frank's assets, subpoenaing bank records and investment accounts to determine the full extent of his cryptocurrency activities. What we found was staggering. Frank hadn't just made $200,000 in Bitcoin profits. Over the past 8 months, he'd been actively trading multiple digital currencies, using Sarah's business account to hide profits that now totaled more than $400,000. They'd reinvested some of those gains in other opportunities: tech stocks, foreign currency futures, even some traditional real estate investment trusts. Sarah's consulting business was primarily a front for managing the investment portfolio Frank had built using knowledge and connections developed during our marriage. She'd been learning from him while also providing him access to markets and opportunities he couldn't pursue on his own because of our joint financial arrangements. This is a substantial marital asset, Helen explained during our meeting. Even though the money is in Sarah's name, it was earned using your husband's expertise and connections during your marriage. You're entitled to half, probably more given the deceptive way it was hidden from you. $400,000. More money than Frank had earned in any 5-year period during his accounting career. Money that could have secured our retirement, paid off our apartment, given us financial freedom in our golden years. Instead, he'd chosen to share it with his lover, while I worked double shifts to contribute grocery money to their household. The betrayal felt deeper with every new revelation. Frank called that Thursday, his voice shaky with what might have been fear or guilt, or both. Eleanor, we need to talk. About everything. About the money, about Sarah, about what happens next. What's there to talk about? I asked. You lied to me, cheated on me, and stole from me. My lawyer will be in touch about asset division. Please don't do this. Please don't destroy our family over a mistake. A mistake. $400,000 in hidden assets and months of adultery, reduced to a simple mistake. Frank, you didn't accidentally sleep with our daughter-in-law. You didn't accidentally set up secret bank accounts and rent a Manhattan apartment. You made conscious choices day after day to betray everything we'd built together. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm sorrier than you can imagine. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through the trust issues, rebuild what we had. What we had was based on honesty and partnership. You destroyed both of those things. What about Michael? What about our grandson we're supposed to have someday? Are you willing to tear apart his family because I made mistakes? The manipulation was breathtaking. Frank was trying to make me responsible for the consequences of his choices, trying to make me the villain in the story of our marriage's demise. You tore apart his family when you decided to sleep with his wife, I said calmly. Any pain Michael experiences from our divorce is your responsibility, not mine. That weekend, I took another step toward reclaiming my life. I went apartment hunting. Queens has neighborhoods I'd never explored in nearly 30 years of living here, pockets of culture and community that existed beyond my daily routine of home and work. With Emily as my guide, I looked at one-bedroom apartments in Astoria and Long Island City, small but bright spaces with hardwood floors and updated kitchens. This one has a view of the Manhattan skyline, the real estate agent said, opening the curtains in a 7th-floor apartment near the Astoria Park. Very popular with young professionals. I stood at the window looking across the East River at the glittering towers of Midtown, trying to imagine myself living here alone, starting over at 68. The view was spectacular, the apartment clean and modern. But it also cost more per month than Frank and I spent on all our household expenses combined. It's beautiful, I told the agent, but probably out of my budget. What kind of budget are we working with? That was the question I couldn't answer yet. My share of the cryptocurrency assets would give me more financial security than I'd ever had, but I didn't know when those funds would be accessible or what Frank might do to complicate the process. In the meantime, I had my diner salary and whatever portion of our joint savings I could access. As we walked through more apartments that afternoon, I found myself gravitating towards smaller, simpler spaces. Places where I could read in the morning without worrying about disturbing someone else, where I could paint my walls whatever color I liked, where I could invite Emily over for dinner without navigating the complex dynamics of my failing marriage. You seem different, Emily said as we grabbed coffee after the apartment viewings. Calmer, somehow. I feel like I can breathe for the first time in months, I admitted. Even with all the uncertainty, even with the divorce proceedings and the money questions, I feel more like myself than I have in years. You know what I think? I think Uncle Frank didn't just cheat on your marriage. I think he cheated you out of knowing who you could be without him. That night, I made a list of things I wanted to do once my divorce was final. Learn to paint watercolors, take a pottery class, visit the Metropolitan Museum of Art on weekday afternoons when it wasn't crowded, read books Frank would have found boring, cook meals I enjoyed instead of meals I thought he expected. Travel. That was the big one. I'd always wanted to see New England in the fall, to drive through Vermont and New Hampshire when the leaves were changing. Frank had never been interested in tourist traps, preferring to spend our vacation time visiting his sister in Florida or staying home to catch up on household projects. But with my share of the cryptocurrency money, I could afford to travel. I could afford to be curious about the world instead of just dutiful about my responsibilities. The new year arrived with a snowstorm that blanketed Queens in pristine white, transforming our familiar streets into something magical and new. I'd always loved snow days, the way they forced everyone to slow down and pay attention to simple pleasures. This year, the snow felt like a metaphor for the fresh start I was building. Frank called on New Year's Day, sounding drunk and maudlin. "I miss you," he said without preamble. "I miss our life together. I miss having someone who knows me completely." "You threw away the person who knew you completely," I said. "I thought I knew you, Frank. I thought I understood what you valued, what mattered to you, what you were capable of. Turns out I didn't know you at all. You knew me better than anyone. That's why this hurts so much. This hurts because you betrayed me in every possible way. Emotionally, physically, financially. You took 42 years of trust and partnership and threw it away for some excitement with a younger woman. It wasn't about her being younger. It was about feeling valued again, feeling like I still had something important to contribute. You did have something important to contribute. To our marriage, to our family, to our life together. But you decided that wasn't enough. After I hung up, I opened a bottle of champagne I'd been saving and toasted my own resilience. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman who defined herself entirely through her relationships with other people. Frank's wife, Michael's mother, Sarah's mother-in-law. Now I was becoming Eleanor again, a person with her own interests and ambitions and dreams. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I'd expected. Frank didn't contest my claims about the hidden assets, probably because his lawyer advised him that fighting would only make things worse. The cryptocurrency profits were indeed considered marital property, and I was entitled to half plus additional compensation for the deceptive way they'd been hidden from me. By March, I had a check for $250,000 and a finalized divorce decree. Frank kept our Queens apartment and most of our retirement savings. I kept my share of the Bitcoin money and my freedom. I used part of the money to put a deposit on a one-bedroom apartment in Astoria with hardwood floors and big windows that let in morning light. The rest went into conservative investments that would provide steady income to supplement my Social Security when I reached retirement age. For the first time in my adult life, I had complete control over my own financial future. Michael took the news of our divorce badly, as I'd known he would. He blamed himself for not seeing the signs, blamed me for not trying harder to save the marriage, blamed Frank for being selfish and destructive. Most of all, he was devastated by the realization that his father had been having an affair with his wife. When the truth finally came out, because it had to come out, because secrets that big don't stay hidden forever, Michael moved out of the apartment he'd shared with Sarah and filed for his own divorce. The confrontation between father and son was apparently explosive, full of accusations and recriminations that permanently damaged their relationship. "I don't understand how he could do this to our family," Michael said during one of our weekly dinners, his voice thick with anger and grief. "I don't understand how she could do this. They destroyed everything. They made choices that hurt people they claimed to love," I said carefully. "But you're going to be okay. We're both going to be okay. How can you be so calm about this? Aren't you furious?" I considered the question seriously. Was I furious? I had been, in the beginning. But anger is exhausting to maintain, and I'd found that beneath the rage was something more complicated. Disappointment, sadness, and ultimately a kind of relief that the pretense was finally over. "I'm angry about the lies," I said finally. "I'm angry about the money he hid from me and the way he made me feel like I was going crazy when I suspected something was wrong. But I'm not angry about the divorce itself. I'm actually grateful that I found out the truth before I wasted any more years living a lie." Michael looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "But you loved him." I did love him. I loved the man I thought he was, the life I thought we had together. But that turned out to be partially an illusion. Now I get to build something real. Sarah tried to reconcile with Michael, claiming the affair had been a temporary lapse in judgment brought on by the stress of starting her business. She blamed Frank for taking advantage of her vulnerability, for manipulating her into a relationship she'd never really wanted. It was a masterful performance, but Michael wasn't buying it. "She had choices," he told me after their final conversation. "She could have talked to me about feeling overwhelmed or unappreciated. She could have ended the business relationship with Dad if it was becoming inappropriate. Instead, she chose to lie to me every single day for months while she fucked my father. I can't forgive that." Frank tried to reconcile with me too, showing up at my new apartment with flowers and promises of counseling and declarations that he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He looked older than his 71 years, worn down by guilt and the consequences of his choices. "I'll do anything," he said, standing in my doorway like a door-to-door salesman pitching a product nobody wanted. "Therapy, church counseling, whatever it takes. I can't lose you, Eleanor. I can't lose us. There is no us anymore," I said gently. "There hasn't been an us for a long time. I think we both knew that. But instead of facing it honestly, you decided to find someone else while keeping me as your safety net. That's not fair. I never stopped loving you. Love isn't just a feeling, Frank. It's a choice you make every day. You chose to lie to me, to betray me, to build a secret life with someone else. You chose to make me feel crazy for suspecting what was happening right in front of my face. Those weren't the choices of someone who loved me. He left that day looking defeated, and I felt sorry for him despite everything. Frank had blown up his entire life for an affair that probably wouldn't have lasted another 6 months. Sarah was already moving on, using her share of their cryptocurrency profits to relocate to Los Angeles, where she planned to build her consulting business among the tech entrepreneurs and entertainment industry executives who understood the value of innovative financial strategies. But my pity for Frank didn't translate into forgiveness or reconciliation. Some betrayals are too deep to heal. Some trust too broken to rebuild. I was 68 years old, too old to waste time on relationships that required constant vigilance and doubt. Spring in New York is a season of renewal, and this year I felt the symbolism more acutely than ever. I signed up for the watercolor painting class I'd been dreaming about, started volunteering at the Queens Museum, took weekend trips to places I'd never explored despite living in the city for decades. My apartment became a reflection of my new independence. Bright paintings on the walls, books stacked on every surface, a small kitchen table set for one with flowers from the farmer's market. I learned to cook for myself, to enjoy my own company, to make decisions based solely on my own preferences and needs. The women in my painting class became unexpected friends. Other ladies in their 60s and 70s who were also redefining what their lives could look like. We went to museum exhibitions together, shared recommendations for books and restaurants, supported each other through the ordinary challenges of aging and loss. "You're glowing," Emily said during one of our regular coffee dates. "I know that sounds cheesy, but you actually look younger than you did when you were married." She was right. The constant stress of living with secrets and lies had been aging me in ways I hadn't recognized until it was gone. Now I slept better, smiled more easily, moved through the world with a lightness I'd forgotten was possible. That summer, I took my first solo vacation, a week in Vermont during peak foliage season, staying at a bed and breakfast in a town so small it barely appeared on maps. I spent my days hiking easy trails through forests of gold and crimson, my evenings reading on the inn's wraparound porch, while other guests shared stories of their own travels and adventures. One evening, I struck up a conversation with another solo traveler, a retired teacher named Robert, who was driving through New England in a restored vintage Airstream trailer. He had kind eyes and a gentle sense of humor, and we ended up talking for hours about books and travel and the unexpected freedom that comes with redefining yourself in your later years. "I was married for 38 years, he told me as we watched the sunset from the porch. "Lost my wife to cancer 3 years ago. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life missing her, and I do miss her terribly. But I'm also discovering parts of myself that got buried under 40 years of couplehood. It's possible to grieve what you've lost while also celebrating what you've gained." I understood exactly what he meant. We exchanged contact information before parting ways, and over the following months, we developed a friendship conducted primarily through long emails and occasional phone calls. Robert was traveling the country in his Airstream, visiting national parks and small towns, documenting his journey through photography and journaling. His stories of life on the road sparked something in me I hadn't expected: wanderlust. By winter, I'd started researching my own travel plans. Not an RV adventure, that level of uncertainty wasn't for me, but organized tours and road trips and cities I'd always wanted to explore. My divorce settlement had given me financial security, my independence had given me confidence, and my age had given me the wisdom to know that opportunities don't wait forever. Michael and I had dinner every other week, slowly rebuilding our relationship on new terms. He was doing well professionally, having been promoted to senior portfolio manager and earning enough to afford his own apartment without financial help from anyone. The betrayal by both his father and his ex-wife had wounded him deeply, but he was seeing a therapist and gradually learning to trust again. "I keep thinking about how different things might have been if Dad had just talked to you about feeling unfulfilled in retirement," he said during one of our dinners. "If he'd suggested couples counseling or found a hobby that made him feel important again, or just been honest about what he was going through." Some people handle midlife crises by buying sports cars or taking up rock climbing, I said. Your father decided to have an affair with his daughter-in-law and hide hundreds of thousands of dollars in cryptocurrency profits. It's like he chose the most destructive possible response to getting older. Do you think you'll ever forgive him? I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness had been an important value in my upbringing. Something my mother had taught me was essential for inner peace. But forgiveness didn't necessarily mean reconciliation or trust. It meant releasing the anger that was corroding my own happiness. I think I'm working toward forgiving him, I said finally. Not because he deserves it, but because I deserve to be free from anger and resentment. But forgiving someone doesn't mean you have to rebuild a relationship with them. What about seeing him at family events, holidays and weddings and things like that? It was a good question. Michael would probably get married again someday. Might have children. Would Frank and I be able to coexist peacefully at important family gatherings? We'll figure it out when we need to, I said. Right now, I'm focused on building my own life instead of managing relationships with people who hurt me. That spring, on the anniversary of our divorce, I received an unexpected card from Frank. Inside was a handwritten note apologizing again for the pain he'd caused and acknowledging that he understood why I couldn't forgive him. He was seeing a therapist, he wrote, trying to understand the choices he'd made and the selfishness that had driven them. He didn't expect reconciliation or even friendship, but he wanted me to know that he recognized the depth of his betrayal and took full responsibility for it. It was the first honest communication I'd received from him in years. I didn't respond to the card, but I kept it. Not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder that people are capable of growth and self-awareness even after they've caused tremendous damage. Frank's apology didn't change the past or repair the trust he'd broken, but it acknowledged truth in a way that felt important. That summer, 2 years after discovering Frank's affair, I took the trip I'd been planning for months. 3 weeks in Italy, visiting Rome and Florence and Venice and smaller towns in Tuscany, whose names I could barely pronounce. It was the kind of extravagant vacation Frank would have called impractical and expensive, which made it even more satisfying. I joined a travel group designed for single women over 50, a mix of widows and divorcees and never-married adventurers who decided to see the world on their own terms. We were an unlikely band of companions, a retired nurse from Boston, a former executive from Chicago, an artist from Santa Fe, a librarian from Portland, but we bonded over shared meals and museum visits and the peculiar freedom of being untethered from other people's expectations. In Rome, I stood in the Sistine Chapel with tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by the beauty of Michelangelo's ceiling. In Florence, I spent an entire afternoon sketching in the Uffizi, trying to capture details from masterpieces with my amateur watercolor skills. In Venice, I rode a gondola at sunset and felt like I was floating through a dream. But the most transformative moment came in a small hilltop town in Tuscany, where I sat alone in a cafe overlooking rolling vineyards and realized I was completely happy. Not happy despite being alone, but happy because I was alone. Happy because every decision about how to spend my time was mine to make. Happy because my days were filled with beauty and discovery instead of obligation and resentment. I pulled out my phone and texted Emily. "I'm having the time of my life." She wrote back immediately. "You deserve it. Every minute of happiness, every gorgeous view, every delicious meal. You earned this freedom, and I had earned it. Through 42 years of marriage, 28 years of motherhood, 6 years of waitressing, and 2 years of rebuilding my life from scratch. I'd earned the right to prioritize my own happiness, to spend my money on experiences that brought me joy, to wake up each morning without worrying about anyone else's needs or expectations. On my last night in Italy, I called Robert from my hotel room in Rome. He was somewhere in Montana, parked beside a lake whose name I immediately forgot, watching stars that were invisible in New York's light pollution. "How was the trip?" he asked. "Life-changing," I said without hesitation. I never understood before how much of myself I'd given up to maintain my marriage. Not just the big things, but the small daily choices about how to spend my time and energy. Being alone for 3 weeks, making every decision based on what I wanted to do, it felt like meeting myself for the first time. "I know exactly what you mean," Robert said. "That's the gift of starting over later in life. You know yourself well enough to be intentional about what you build. When I returned to New York, I started planning my next adventure. 3 years after my divorce was finalized, I ran into Frank at the grocery store in our old neighborhood. I was visiting Michael, helping him move into a new apartment with the woman he'd been dating for 8 months, a kind and funny teacher named Jessica who treated him with the respect and honesty he deserved. Frank was in the produce section, examining avocados with the methodical attention he'd always brought to grocery shopping. He looked older, grayer, more fragile than the man who'd walked out of our apartment with a suitcase and elaborate justifications for his betrayal. When he saw me, his face lit up with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Eleanor," he said softly, "you look wonderful." I did look wonderful. I was tanned from a recent trip to Greece, wearing a dress I'd bought in Santorini that made me feel elegant and vibrant. My hair was shorter now, cut in a style that framed my face and made my gray streaks look intentional instead of inevitable. "Thank you," I said simply. "How are you, Frank?" He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "I'm working on being better, healthier, more honest with myself and other people." "That's good," I said, and meant it. We stood there for a moment, two people who'd shared most of their adult lives, now essentially strangers making polite conversation in a grocery store. It should have been awkward or painful, but instead it felt peaceful. The anger and hurt that had defined our interactions for so long had been replaced by something more like indifference. "I heard you've been traveling," Frank said. "Michael mentioned Italy and Greece. That's wonderful. You always wanted to see those places." "I'm leaving for Ireland next month," I said. "A photography tour through the countryside." "Photography? I didn't know you were interested in that." "There are lots of things about me you didn't know," I said gently. "I'm still discovering some of them myself." Before we parted ways, Frank asked if I was happy. It was such a simple question, but it stopped me in my tracks because the answer was so unequivocally yes. "I am happy," I said. "Happier than I've been in years. Maybe happier than I've ever been." "I'm glad," he said, and I could tell he meant it despite the pain it probably caused him to hear. "I'm really glad, Eleanor." That evening, as I helped Michael and Jessica arrange furniture in their new living room, I thought about happiness and how differently I understood it now. For most of my life, happiness had been something I thought would come naturally from doing the right things, being a good wife, a devoted mother, a reliable employee. I'd believed that if I met everyone else's needs and fulfilled my obligations, contentment would follow automatically. But that kind of happiness had always been fragile, dependent on other people's choices and feelings and circumstances beyond my control. The happiness I'd found in the past few years was different, more stable, more authentic, more genuinely mine. "You seem so at peace," Jessica said as we stood back to admire our decorating efforts. "Michael talks about how much you've changed since the divorce, how much more confident and adventurous you've become. Divorce was the best thing that ever happened to me," I said, then laughed at how that sounded. "I don't mean the betrayal or the lies or the pain of it, but being forced to rebuild my life from scratch at 68 taught me things about myself I never would have learned otherwise." "Like what?" "Like I'm braver than I thought. I'm more resilient than I thought. I have better instincts about people and situations than I gave myself credit for. I'm interesting company for myself, and I deserve to be treated with respect and valued for who I am, not just for what I can do for other people." Later that week, I had lunch with Emily to celebrate her recent promotion to assistant director at the arts nonprofit, where she'd been working for 5 years. She'd grown into such an impressive young woman, confident and principled and unafraid to speak truth even when it was uncomfortable. "You know what I realized the other day?" she said as we shared dessert at our favorite cafe in Astoria. "You saved my life." "What do you mean?" "Watching you rebuild after the divorce, seeing how you refused to let Uncle Frank's betrayal define your worth or limit your possibilities. It taught me what self-respect looks like. I broke up with that guy I was dating, the one who was always criticizing my appearance and trying to make me feel lucky to be with him. I realized I'd rather be alone than be with someone who doesn't appreciate me." "Good for you," I said, squeezing her hand across the table. "I learned that from you. I learned that being alone isn't the worst thing that can happen to someone. Being with the wrong person is much worse. Being alone can actually be wonderful, I said. It took me 68 years to figure that out, but it's true. When you're not constantly managing someone else's emotions and needs, you have so much more energy for your own growth and happiness. That night, I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea and a book, surrounded by photographs from my travels and paintings from my art classes, planning my next adventure. I was thinking about taking a creative writing class, about learning to use the good camera I'd bought for my photography tours, about maybe getting a small dog for companionship. My life at 71 looked nothing like what I'd imagined when I was married to Frank. It was smaller in some ways. No husband, no extended family obligations, no illusions of being needed by people who took my sacrifices for granted. But it was also immeasurably richer, more authentic, more intentional, more genuinely mine. I thought about that moment at Michael's engagement party, when Frank's hand had moved to Sarah's back and Emily had whispered, "Now you know." At the time, those words had felt like a death sentence, the end of everything I'd believed about my life and my marriage. Now I understood they'd been an invitation to freedom. The truth had destroyed the life I thought I wanted, but it had given me the chance to build the life I actually needed. A life where I was valued for who I was, rather than criticized for who I wasn't. A life where my time and energy belonged to me. A life where I could wake up each morning and make choices based on my own happiness rather than everyone else's expectations. I raised my teacup in a silent toast to Emily, to honesty, to the courage it takes to start over when starting over feels impossible. Outside my windows, Queens glittered with the lights of a million other stories, other lives, other people figuring out how to be happy in their own complicated ways. Tomorrow I would work in my garden, call Robert to hear about his latest travels, plan the details of my Ireland trip. I would live my life as Eleanor, not as someone's wife or mother or caretaker, but as myself. It had taken me 7 decades to understand that being myself was not only enough, it was everything. As I sit here now, reflecting on this journey that transformed my entire understanding of love, betrayal, and self-worth, I realize something profound. Those moments that seem to destroy us often become the foundation for our greatest growth. Have you ever lived or known someone who lived something like this? A betrayal so deep it shattered everything you believed about your life, only to discover that you were stronger than you ever imagined? Please share your story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you found strength in my journey, if my story reminded you that it's never too late to reclaim your worth and rebuild your happiness, please like this video and subscribe. It helps me continue opening my heart and sharing these truths that so many of us carry in silence. Thank you for listening. Thank you for witnessing. And remember, respect isn't earned by silence. It's claimed by courage.